The diplomatic shuttle Harmonic Convergence descended through Xerion Prime's amber atmosphere like a falling star, its hull scarred by 3 days of dodging Vorthak patrol ships. Ambassador Kethvar pressed his six-fingered hand against the viewport, watching the planet's surface reveal itself through the chemical haze that perpetually shrouded the world. What he saw defied everything the Galactic Council's intelligence reports had prepared him for. Where there should have been the geometric perfection of human defensive installations, he found chaos. Makeshift barriers constructed from crashed ships and mining equipment stretched across what had once been fertile plains. Smoke columns rose from 100 different points, marking battles that had raged for weeks without pause. The humans hadn't built a fortress to defend their colony. They had turned the entire continent into a weapon. Ambassador, his pilot's translated voice buzzed through the cabin speakers. The humans are directing us to landing coordinates. Their communication officer sounds different from our previous contacts. Kethvar's crest fluttered with unease. In his 2 centuries of diplomatic service, he had negotiated with species ranging from the crystal-minded ethereals to the hive consciousness of the swarming reaches. Each race had its patterns, its predictable responses to pressure. Humans had always been an anomaly in Galactic Council records, too young to matter, too few to threaten, too stubborn to ignore completely. Their small collection of colonies scattered across 12 systems had been viewed as a curiosity at best, a minor irritant at worst. But now, with the Vorthak hegemony bearing down on their most remote outpost, the humans had done something unprecedented. They had refused evacuation. They had rejected offers of asylum. When the Council had suggested strategic withdrawal to preserve their species, the human representative had simply stated, "We appreciate your concern, but some lines cannot be crossed." The shuttle touched down in what appeared to be a converted mining facility. Heavy machinery had been repurposed into crude defensive positions, and Kethvar could see human soldiers. If the disheveled figures in mismatched armor could be called soldiers, moving with purposeful efficiency between makeshift bunkers. As the diplomatic party disembarked, the first thing that struck him was the sound. Every human settlement he had visited before carried the ambient noise of civilization, conversations, machinery, the routine bustle of daily life. Here, there was something else. A low, persistent humming that seemed to emanate from the humans themselves. Not a mechanical sound, but something organic. Something that made the translator nodes in Kethvar's skull ache with interference. Ambassador Kethvar. The voice belonged to a human female approaching their landing platform. She wore the informal uniform of a colonial administrator, though the plasma burns on her clothing and the bandage across her left temple suggested her duties had expanded considerably. "I'm Director Maria Santos. Thank you for coming." Kethvar performed the ritual greeting gesture, touching his forehead with 3 fingers while lowering his crest in acknowledgement. "Director Santos, the Galactic Council extends its continued offer of emergency evacuation. Our transport capacity has been discussed and declined," Santos interrupted with a politeness that somehow felt more threatening than outright hostility. "But we appreciate the gesture. Commander Chen asked me to bring you to the command center immediately. There are some things you need to see before the Council makes any final decisions about our situation." As they walked through the converted facility, Kethvar found himself studying the humans around them. These weren't the polished diplomats or carefully selected representatives he typically encountered. These were ordinary colonists, farmers, miners, technical specialists, who had somehow transformed themselves into something else entirely. Their movements held a precision that spoke of endless drilling. Their eyes carried a focus that reminded him uncomfortably of the predatory species that hunted in the deep void between stars. "How many defenders do you have?" Kethvar asked, though his preliminary scans had already provided estimates. 3,218 as of this morning, Santos replied without hesitation, down from our original population of 12,000. "We've been consolidating resources." The casual way she mentioned the loss of nearly 9,000 people sent a chill through Kethvar's exoskeleton. "Director, surely you understand the mathematics of your situation. The Vorthak Expeditionary Force numbers in the millions. Even if every human here were a trained military specialist, we'd still be outnumbered 4,000 to 1. Santos stopped walking and turned to face him directly. "Ambassador, may I ask you a personal question? In all your diplomatic experience, have you ever encountered a species that fought to the point of extinction rather than accept subjugation?" Kethvar considered the question carefully. "Several species have chosen mass suicide over slavery. The Morning Clans of Rigel actually developed biological weapons specifically to—" "That's not what I asked." Santos resumed walking, leading him deeper into the facility. I asked if you'd encountered anyone who fought. Not died, fought. Who looked at impossible odds and decided that impossible just meant they'd have to try harder. The distinction struck Kethvar as semantic rather than meaningful, but before he could respond, they emerged into what had once been the facility's central processing chamber. The space had been converted into a command center that defied conventional military logic. Rather than the sterile efficiency typical of Galactic Council war rooms, this felt organic, almost tribal. Displays showing tactical information shared wall space with personal photographs and handwritten messages. The central holographic display didn't show sterile unit positions, but rather a three-dimensional representation of the battlefield that included terrain features, weather patterns, and what appeared to be psychological assessment markers for both human and Vorthak forces. At the center of this controlled chaos stood Commander Sarah Chen, and Kethvar understood immediately why the Council's psychological profiles had failed to categorize her properly. She possessed the kind of presence that couldn't be quantified in standard diplomatic metrics. A gravitational pull that drew attention not through volume or posture, but through an intensity that seemed to compress the space around her. Ambassador. Chen acknowledged him with a nod that somehow managed to be both respectful and dismissive. I assume you're here to make one final attempt at convincing us to abandon our world. The Council recognizes humanity's right to self-determination. Kethvar began, falling back on diplomatic protocols. However, we also have an obligation to preserve sentient life where possible. The Vorthak have never accepted surrender from a species that has offered effective resistance. They will not take prisoners. They will not negotiate. They will simply eliminate us. Chen finished for him. Yes, we are aware of their methods. We've studied every engagement they've fought over the past century. We know their tactics, their technology, their psychological profiles. She gestured to the display, which shifted to show a detailed analysis of Vorthak military capabilities. What we know and what we accept are two different things. Kethvar studied the data streaming across the holographic interface. The humans' intelligence gathering was remarkably thorough, perhaps even superior to what the Council's military analysts had compiled. But intelligence meant nothing against such overwhelming numerical superiority. Commander, I've read your military record. You're not a fool. You understand that courage alone cannot overcome these odds. You're right. Courage can't. Chen moved to a secondary display that showed something Kethvar didn't immediately recognize. Complex mathematical models that seemed to incorporate variables far beyond standard military planning. But courage combined with proper preparation, tactical innovation, and absolute commitment to victory regardless of personal cost? That's a different equation entirely. She manipulated the display, and Kethvar found himself looking at detailed schematics of modifications the humans had made to everything from their personal weapons to the planet's orbital defense platforms. None of it should have been particularly impressive. Human technology lagged behind Galactic Council standards by at least 50 years, and the Vorthak had military capabilities that surpassed even the Council's best equipment. But there was something about these modifications that made Kethvar's scientific training itch with unease. The humans hadn't simply improved their existing technology, they had fundamentally reimagined how warfare could be conducted. Conventional weapons had been modified to operate in ways that violated standard engineering principles. Personal armor incorporated biological components that his scanner couldn't properly identify. Most disturbing of all, the humans had somehow managed to integrate their mental processes into their tactical networks in ways that suggested they were treating their own consciousness as just another tool to be optimized for combat. Commander, Kethvar said slowly. Some of these modifications appear to be irreversible. The neural integration protocols alone suggest permanent alterations to human brain chemistry. That's correct. Chen's response carried no trace of regret or uncertainty. We calculated that a 10% increase in combat effectiveness was worth the trade-off of never being able to fully return to civilian life. Though I should clarify, that calculation was made collectively. Every person in this facility volunteered for procedures that would optimize their capacity for warfare. The casual way she discussed permanent psychological modifications sent warning signals through every diplomatic protocol Kethvar had ever learned. Species that began altering their fundamental nature for military advantage typically descended into evolutionary dead ends within a few generations. Commander, surely you realize the implications of what you're describing. The Galactic Council has strict prohibitions against irreversible consciousness modification precisely because it creates soldiers who can't be reasoned with. Fighters who will continue combat even when continuation is objectively pointless. Warriors who view death in battle as preferable to survival through compromise. Chen's expression remained perfectly calm, as she essentially described the transformation of her people into something that would be classified as a military abomination under council law. Yes, we considered the implications quite carefully. Director Santos stepped forward, her voice carrying a gentleness that somehow made her words more disturbing rather than less. Ambassador, what you need to understand is that we've moved beyond the question of whether we can win this battle. We've accepted that we probably can't. What we've focused on instead is ensuring that our defeat costs the Vorthak so much that they'll think twice before attacking another human world. Kethvar felt his diplomatic composure beginning to crack. You're describing a strategy of mutual destruction. The Council cannot endorse. We're not asking for endorsement. Chen interrupted. We're informing you that in approximately 36 hours, the largest military force the galaxy has seen in 3 centuries is going to collide with 3,000 humans, who have spent the last 6 months turning themselves into the most efficient killing machines our species is capable of producing. The Council needs to decide whether it wants to have observers present to document what happens next. The implications of that statement struck Kethvar like a physical blow. The humans weren't just planning to fight, they were planning to create a demonstration. An exhibition of human combat capability that would be recorded and distributed throughout the galaxy.
You're using this battle as a message. We're using this battle as a warning. Chen corrected.
The Vorthak have conquered 17 species in the past century by relying on a simple mathematical principle, overwhelming force applied against civilizations that fight according to conventional military logic. But humans don't fight according to conventional logic. We fight according to human logic. Which is, for the first time since Kethvar had arrived. Chen smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. You'll understand after the battle, Ambassador, assuming you choose to stay and witness it. Because what you see here will determine how the rest of the galaxy responds to humanity for the next 1,000 years. The question isn't whether we can win. The question is whether we can lose in such a spectacular fashion that it becomes a victory for every other species that values freedom over subjugation. As if summoned by her words, the facility's alert systems activated with a low, pulsing tone that seemed to resonate in Kethvar's bones. Around them, human soldiers began moving with the smooth efficiency of a choreographed performance, each individual knowing exactly where they needed to be and what they needed to do.
Ambassador, Chen said, already turning toward the tactical displays that were updating with new information.
The Vorthak Advance Force has entered our system. You have about 6 hours to decide whether you want to witness history being made or whether you'd prefer to file your report from a safe distance. Kethvar looked around the command center, watching humans prepare for what any rational analysis would classify as certain death, and realized that everything he thought he knew about warfare was about to be proven wrong. The only question was whether he would have the courage to watch it happen. 6 hours later, Kethvar stood in the observation bunker watching the Vorthak Armada blot out the stars above Zerion Prime. Even through the bunker's reinforced transparasteel viewports, the sheer scale of the invasion force was overwhelming. The ships didn't descend so much as they fell like mechanical rain, each vessel larger than most cities, carrying enough firepower to crack continents. The diplomatic shuttle that had brought him here was long gone, its pilot having exercised considerably more wisdom than Kethvar himself. He had chosen to remain despite every logical argument his training could muster. Something about the human's absolute confidence in the face of annihilation had triggered his scientific curiosity, overriding his survival instincts. Beside him, Director Santos maintained her calm demeanor while monitoring a dozen different communication channels simultaneously. The transformation in the facility over the past 6 hours had been remarkable to witness. What had appeared chaotic when he arrived now revealed itself as a carefully orchestrated preparation for something far more complex than simple military resistance. "First wave incoming," announced a technician whose age couldn't have exceeded 20 standard years. Vortag drop pods launching from the primary assault carriers. Estimated time to surface impact, 12 minutes. Kethvar studied the tactical display showing the incoming Vorthak forces. The enemy deployment followed standard shock doctrine, overwhelming the defenders with massive numbers while maintaining strategic reserves for exploitation of any breakthroughs. By every military principle he understood, the humans should be preparing final defensive positions, maximizing the utility of their limited numbers by fighting from prepared positions that would force the Vorthak to assault them directly. Instead, the human forces were moving into open terrain. "Director," Kethvar said, his voice tight with confusion, "your people are abandoning their defensive positions." "We're not abandoning anything, Ambassador. We're advancing to contact." Santos manipulated her control interface, and the display shifted to show individual human units moving across the battlefield with a precision that defied explanation. The Vorthak expect us to fight like every other species they've conquered. They expect defensive lines, strategic withdrawals, attempts to maximize the value of prepared positions. Those are sound tactical principles, Cathvar protested. Forcing an attacker to come to you while you maintain defensive advantages is basic military doctrine across every advanced civilization.
Exactly.
Santos's smile contained something that made Cathvar's skin crawl. Which is why we're going to do the opposite. The first Vorthak drop pods impacted the surface with concussive force that registered on seismic monitors 15 kilometers away. Each pod contained 50 Vorthak shock troops, genetically enhanced warriors bred specifically for rapid planetary conquest. Within minutes, the landing zone would be swarming with thousands of elite soldiers, equipped with advanced weaponry and tactical systems that had proven effective against civilizations far more technologically sophisticated than humanity. What emerged from the pods was indeed formidable. Vorthak shock troops stood 3 meters tall, their natural exoskeletons augmented with powered armor that incorporated both energy shielding and kinetic dispersion fields. They moved with the coordinated precision of a hive mind, each warrior linked to its companions through quantum communication networks that made them nearly impossible to surprise or outmaneuver. The humans attacked them anyway. Cathvar watched in fascination and horror as small groups of human soldiers emerged from concealment and charged directly into the Vorthak formations. Not from defensive positions. Not with supporting artillery. Not with numerical superiority or technological advantage. They simply ran directly at an enemy that outmassed them, outgunned them, and outnumbered them by factors that should have made resistance pointless. And somehow, impossibly, they were winning. The first indication that something was wrong with Cathvar's understanding of the situation came when he noticed that the Vorthak formations were breaking apart. Species that had conquered half the galaxy didn't panic under pressure. They didn't lose tactical cohesion when faced with inferior enemies. But that was exactly what appeared to be happening on the surface below. How? Cathvar whispered, watching human soldiers tear through Vorthak lines with weapons that should have been inadequate for the task. They're fighting something they've never encountered before, Santos explained, her attention divided between multiple tactical feeds. Every species the Vorthak have faced has fought according to rational military principles. They calculate losses, they attempt to preserve forces, they retreat when positions become untenable. Rational behavior. On the display, a group of 12 human soldiers had surrounded a Vorthak heavy weapons position that contained nearly 100 enemy troops. Rather than attempting to outflank or suppress the position, the humans were charging directly into the center of the enemy formation. Cathvar watched in stunned silence as the humans absorbed casualties that should have destroyed their unit cohesion, then continued fighting with an intensity that seemed to increase rather than decrease as their numbers dwindled. But this is suicide, Cathvar protested. Effective combat requires preservation of force, tactical flexibility, strategic reserve. All concepts that assume your primary objective is winning the current engagement while preserving capability for future operations. Santos interrupted. But what if winning the current engagement isn't your primary objective? What if your primary objective is demonstrating that attacking you costs more than any rational enemy is willing to pay? The human assault on the weapons position concluded with the destruction of both the Vorthak defenders and all but one of the attacking humans. Under any normal analysis, this would be classified as a tactical defeat. The humans had lost 90% of their force to eliminate an enemy position that could have been bypassed entirely. But as Cathvar watched the tactical implications unfold, he began to understand what Santos was describing. The destruction of that single weapons position had required the Vorthak to commit additional forces to investigate what had happened. Those forces encountered prepared human positions that had been deliberately positioned to exploit the enemy's predictable response. The resulting engagement drew in more Vorthak reserves, which triggered additional human responses that seemed designed not to inflict maximum casualties, but to force the enemy to make increasingly difficult tactical decisions. You're not trying to win individual battles, Cathvar realized. You're trying to force them into a strategic situation they can't resolve through conventional military action. The Vorthak have conquered 17 species using the same basic approach, Santos confirmed. Overwhelming force applied against enemies who fight according to predictable patterns. But humans don't fight according to predictable patterns. We fight according to human patterns. A new alert sounded through the command center, and Cathvar's attention was drawn to a secondary display showing orbital imagery. The main Vorthak assault force was beginning its descent. Not the advanced scouts that had been engaging human forces for the past hour, But the actual invasion army, hundreds of massive transport ships were disgorging millions of soldiers across a landing zone that stretched from horizon to horizon. Any rational military analysis would classify what was about to happen as a massacre. The humans had perhaps 3,000 soldiers remaining from their original force. The Vorthak were deploying an army that numbered in the millions. The mathematical disparity was so extreme that it moved beyond tactics into the realm of simple physics. "Final phase initiation," announced Commander Chen's voice over the communication system. "All units advance to ultimate engagement parameters. Xenocide protocol is now active." Kethvar felt every diplomatic instinct he possessed activating alarm protocols in his consciousness. Xenocide protocol was a term that appeared in the darkest warnings contained within Galactic Council historical archives. It referred to military doctrines so extreme that they were considered violations of the basic principles of civilized warfare. "Director," he said, his voice carrying undertones of official council authority, "I must formally advise you that the Galactic Council cannot endorse military actions that—" "Ambassador," Santos interrupted, her tone remaining polite while somehow conveying absolute finality. "In approximately 15 minutes, you're going to understand why ancient star charts mark human space with warning symbols written in dead languages. The Council's endorsement is irrelevant." On the surface below, human forces were converging toward the center of the Vorthak landing zone, not attempting to establish defensive perimeters, not trying to delay the enemy advance, not following any recognizable military doctrine. They were moving directly toward the largest concentration of enemy forces with the apparent intention of engaging them in direct combat. "This is insane," Kethvar muttered, watching human soldiers advance across open terrain toward an enemy that possessed overwhelming advantages in numbers, technology, and tactical position. "Yes," Santos agreed. "From any rational perspective, what we're about to do violates every principle of effective warfare. But humans don't fight according to rational principles. We fight according to human principles." "Which are?" Santos turned to face him directly, and Kethvar saw something in her expression that made him understand why ancient civilizations had written warnings about humanity in languages they had hoped would die with their species. "We don't fight to win, Ambassador. We fight so others don't have to." The tactical display updated with new information, and Kethvar found himself looking at something that his scientific training insisted was impossible. The human forces weren't just advancing toward the Vorthak army. They were accelerating. Individual soldiers were moving faster than human physiology should have permitted, carrying weapons that generated energy signatures his scanners couldn't properly analyze, coordinating their actions through communication methods that registered as barely controlled chaos on every monitoring system in the facility. "What have you done to yourselves?" Kethvar whispered. "What we needed to do," Santos replied simply. "The modifications we've made aren't just technological, Ambassador. We've fundamentally altered how we experience combat. Human soldiers on that battlefield aren't thinking about survival, or victory, or strategic objectives. They're thinking about one thing only. Which is..." Santos gestured toward the display, where human forces were making contact with the outer edges of the Vorthak army. Even through the bunker's sensory dampening systems, Kethvar could hear something that made his translator nodes malfunction completely. A sound that was part war cry, part musical harmony, part something else entirely that his species had no frame of reference for understanding. They're thinking about how much damage they can inflict before they die. And Ambassador, humans are remarkably creative when it comes to inflicting damage. The first human wave hit the Vorthak lines with an impact that registered on seismic sensors across the continent. What followed defied every principle of warfare Kethvar had ever studied. The humans weren't fighting like soldiers. They weren't fighting like any recognizable military force. They were fighting like a natural disaster that had somehow developed tactical awareness. Individual human soldiers were taking on entire Vorthak squads and winning through methods that violated the basic physics of personal combat. Groups of humans were penetrating enemy formations that should have been impenetrable, then somehow managing to maintain combat effectiveness even when completely surrounded. Most disturbing of all, human casualty rates seemed to have no impact whatsoever on their overall combat efficiency. "How?" Kethvar asked again, watching displays that showed impossible things happening with routine regularity. "Because we're not fighting to live, Ambassador," Santos explained, her voice carrying the kind of calm certainty typically reserved for fundamental physical laws. "We're fighting to make sure that every species in this galaxy understands what happens when you threaten something humans have decided to protect." On the surface below, 3,000 humans were teaching 12 million Vorthak warriors why the universe had learned to fear the species that called itself humanity. And Kethvar was beginning to understand that what he was witnessing wasn't a battle at all. It was a demonstration. The sound began 30 minutes after first contact, and it changed everything. Kethvar had heard combat before. The harsh bark of energy weapons, the thunder of artillery, the controlled chaos of organized violence between civilized species. What rose from the battlefield below was something else entirely. It started as individual voices raised in what his translator systems interpreted as combat calls. But as the battle intensified, those voices merged into something that bypassed his auditory processing entirely and struck directly at the primitive fear centers of his brain. The humans were singing. Not the ritual war chants of primitive species, not the coordinated battle hymns of militaristic cultures. This was something that seemed to emerge organically from the combat itself, as if warfare was a form of music that humans had been composing for millennia. The melody, if it could be called that, wove through the sounds of battle without being drowned out by them. Instead, the weapons fire and explosions became part of the composition, each shot and detonation adding to a symphony of violence that had no analog in galactic military history. "Director," Kethvar said, his voice tight with strain, "what are they doing?" Santos never looked away from her displays, but her expression carried something that might have been pride mixed with sorrow. "They're doing what humans do when they're pushed beyond the breaking point. They're becoming more human than any individual human has a right to be." On the tactical screens, the impossible was becoming routine. Human forces had not only penetrated the Vorthak lines, but were somehow maintaining offensive momentum, despite being outnumbered by factors that should have made organized resistance mathematically impossible. Individual engagements that should have resulted in immediate human casualties were instead becoming focal points where Vorthak formations found themselves trapped and systematically destroyed. Kethvar studied the combat footage with growing bewilderment. Their tactical coordination makes no sense. They're operating as independent units while somehow maintaining perfect strategic coherence. How are they communicating? "They're not," Santos replied simply. "Not in any conventional sense. The neural modifications we implemented don't just enhance individual combat capability. They create a form of collective combat consciousness. Each soldier knows what every other soldier is thinking, feeling, planning. They've become a single organism with 3,000 bodies." The implications of that statement struck Kethvar like a physical blow. What the humans had done to themselves went far beyond the kind of biological warfare modification that the Galactic Council's most paranoid military theorists had ever imagined. They had voluntarily surrendered individual identity in favor of becoming component parts of something larger and more dangerous. "That's not warfare," Kethvar whispered. "That's evolution occurring in real time." "Yes." Santos's acknowledgement carried no trace of regret or uncertainty. "We calculated that normal human combat effectiveness would be insufficient against Vorthak numbers, so we stopped being normal humans." A new alert drew their attention to orbital sensors, and Kethvar felt his understanding of the situation shift again. The Vorthak command ships were repositioning themselves, moving away from the planet rather than toward it. Species that had conquered half the galaxy didn't retreat from inferior enemies. They didn't exhibit what appeared to be tactical uncertainty when facing opponents they should have been able to crush through simple attrition. "They're afraid," Kethvar realized. "They're learning," Santos corrected. The Vorthak have built their entire military doctrine around the principle that overwhelming force applied against predictable enemies produces inevitable victory, but they've never encountered enemies who become more effective as casualties mount. The truth of that statement was becoming evident on the battlefield below. Human casualties were indeed mounting. The laws of physics couldn't be completely ignored, even by species that seemed determined to rewrite the rules of warfare. But rather than degrading human combat effectiveness, each loss seemed to intensify the performance of the survivors. Units that had lost half their strength were fighting with twice their original efficiency. Soldiers who should have been exhausted after hours of continuous combat were displaying levels of physical capability that exceeded baseline human performance by orders of magnitude. "How long can they maintain this?" Kethvar asked. "Until they're all dead," Santos replied matter-of-factly. "The modifications we've made have essentially eliminated the biological and psychological factors that normally force combatants to withdraw from engagement. Fatigue, fear, self-preservation instincts, rational assessment of tactical impossibility, none of those things affect our forces anymore." Kethvar watched human soldiers continue fighting with wounds that should have been incapacitating, using weapons that should have been depleted, coordinating attacks that should have been impossible given their casualties and the chaos of the battlefield. What you've created isn't an army. It's a weapon that thinks it's human. No, Ambassador. Santos turned to face him, and her expression carried something that made every diplomatic protocol in Kethvar's training activate simultaneously. What we've created is humans who have remembered what they were before civilization taught them to be reasonable. The distinction was lost on Kethvar until he looked at the strategic display and understood what the humans had actually accomplished. The Vorthak invasion force wasn't just being held in place, it was being systematically dismantled, not through superior firepower or tactical brilliance, but through the simple application of a level of violence that no rational military planner could have anticipated or prepared for. The Vorthak have never encountered an enemy that fights without regard for strategic objectives, Santos explained. Every species they've conquered has fought according to logical military principles. Preserve forces, maintain supply lines, retreat when positions become untenable, surrender when defeat becomes inevitable. But humans don't fight according to logical principles when something we care about is threatened. Then how do humans fight? Santos gestured toward the displays showing the ongoing battle. We fight until the other side decides that whatever they wanted isn't worth the cost of taking it from us. As if summoned by her words, new information appeared on the tactical screens. The Vorthak orbital bombardment platforms, massive ships capable of sterilizing entire continents, were activating their primary weapons. The enemy had apparently decided that conventional ground assault was no longer viable. They're going to destroy the planet rather than continue ground operations, Kethvar observed. Yes. Santos began manipulating her control interfaces with the calm efficiency of someone implementing a plan that had been prepared well in advance. We expected this development. The Vorthak have never encountered sustained resistance that couldn't be overcome through conventional military application. When faced with tactical situations they can't resolve through standard doctrine, they default to complete sterilization. Then you've failed. They'll destroy the planet, eliminate human resistance, and continue their expansion without having learned anything meaningful about human combat capability. Santos smiled, and Kethvar realized that every assumption he had made about human strategic planning was about to prove wrong. Ambassador, you're still thinking about this conflict in terms of winning and losing. But this was never about winning. This was about teaching. The orbital bombardment platforms completed their targeting sequences and began charging their primary weapons. In less than 5 minutes, enough energy would be directed at the planet's surface to crack the continental shelf and render Zarian Prime uninhabitable for the next 1,000 years. The Vorthak would achieve their strategic objective of eliminating human resistance, though at a cost in resources that exceeded normal operational parameters. What they had not anticipated was the response. Orbital Defense Protocol 7. Santos announced calmly into her communication system. All surface units implement final demonstration sequence. On the tactical displays, human forces across the battlefield began moving in patterns that defied every military principle Kethvar understood. Rather than seeking shelter from the incoming bombardment or attempting final defensive actions, they were converging on specific geographic points that seemed to have no tactical significance whatsoever.
What are they doing? Kethvar demanded.
Showing the galaxy what happens when you force humans to choose between surrender and extinction, Santos replied, and demonstrating why species that value survival shouldn't make that choice for us. The orbital bombardment began with enough destructive force to reshape geography. Massive energy beams struck the planet's surface with precision that could have eliminated entire cities, while kinetic projectiles traveling at relativistic speeds carved new valleys through what had once been plains and forests. By any rational analysis, nothing on the surface could have survived such overwhelming application of destructive force. The humans survived anyway. More than survived, they adapted. As each bombardment wave struck the surface, human forces somehow anticipated the impact points and repositioned themselves to use the destruction itself as a tactical advantage. Crater walls became defensive positions. Molten rock became concealment. The reshaping of the planet's geography became part of a larger strategic pattern that seemed to treat environmental destruction as just another tool to be incorporated into their combat methodology. This is impossible, Kethvar whispered, watching human soldiers emerge from impacts that should have vaporized them. From any conventional perspective, yes, Santos agreed. But humans don't operate from conventional perspectives when we're protecting something we consider important. We operate from human perspectives. Which are? Santos gestured toward the displays, where human forces were not just surviving orbital bombardment, but somehow using it to enhance their combat effectiveness against the remaining Vorthak ground forces. We operate from the perspective that there is no level of destruction we won't endure, no amount of pain we won't accept, no degree of loss we won't embrace if it means protecting something we've decided to protect. The truth of that statement was being demonstrated in real time across the battlefield. Human soldiers were fighting in conditions that should have been uninhabitable, using destroyed terrain as tactical advantages, coordinating attacks through communication methods that seemed to function independently of any physical infrastructure. They had become something that transcended the normal limitations of biological warfare, transforming themselves into a force that could operate effectively in environments where conventional military forces would simply cease to exist. "What are you?" Kethvar asked, though he wasn't entirely sure he was addressing Santos or the broader concept of humanity itself. "We're the species that every other species in the galaxy hopes they never have to fight," Santos replied simply. "Because when humans fight, we don't fight for territory, or resources, or strategic advantage. We fight for principles, and principles can't be destroyed by orbital bombardment." Above them, the Vorthak command ships were beginning what appeared to be a strategic withdrawal. The species that had conquered 17 civilizations was retreating from a battle they had already technically won, driven away not by military defeat, but by the recognition that continuing the engagement would cost more than any rational objective could justify. But Kethvar was beginning to understand that the lesson the galaxy was about to learn had nothing to do with rational objectives. It had everything to do with what happened when predators encountered something that refused to recognize the concept of prey. The Vorthak withdrawal began at 1447 local time, and with it came the most disturbing revelation of Kethvar's diplomatic career. The humans weren't going to let them leave. What had started as a defensive action against impossible odds had transformed into something that defied classification within existing military frameworks. The surviving human forces, now numbering fewer than 800 individuals, were somehow preventing the retreat of an enemy fleet that retained enough firepower to sterilize entire star systems. "Director," Kethvar said, his voice strained with the effort of processing what his senses were reporting, "your forces are pursuing the Vorthak ships into orbit." Santos never looked up from her tactical displays, though something that might have been satisfaction flickered across her features. "Phase 4, implementation," she confirmed. "We told you this was about teaching the galaxy a lesson. The lesson isn't complete until our enemies understand that attacking humanity doesn't end when they decide they've had enough." Through the bunker's enhanced observation systems, Kethvar watched something that violated his understanding of physics as thoroughly as it violated his understanding of warfare. Human soldiers were somehow maintaining combat operations in orbital space, using equipment that should have been completely inadequate for void warfare against enemies whose technology had been specifically designed for space-based combat. "How are they surviving in vacuum?" Kethvar demanded. "Human physiology doesn't support unprotected exposure to space environment." "Human physiology as you understand it," Santos corrected. "But we stopped limiting ourselves to baseline human capabilities 6 months ago. The modifications we've implemented allow for temporary survival in environments that would normally be lethal to our species." "Temporary survival for how long?" "Long enough to complete the mission." The cold finality of that statement struck Kethvar with the force of revelation. The humans weren't just willing to die for their cause, they had systematically eliminated every biological and psychological limitation that might prevent them from dying as effectively as possible. They had transformed themselves into weapons that happened to be shaped like people. "This isn't warfare," Kethvar protested. "This is controlled extinction." "This is human warfare," Santos replied simply. "When humans fight, we don't fight to achieve acceptable outcomes. We fight to achieve necessary outcomes. And the necessary outcome here is ensuring that every species in the galaxy understands what happens when they threaten something humanity has decided to protect." On the tactical displays, the impossible was becoming routine with such regularity that Kethvar found his scientific training beginning to develop entirely new frameworks for processing information. Human forces had somehow managed to board Vorthak ships that were attempting to retreat beyond the planet's gravity well, not through conventional assault shuttles or boarding pods, but through methods that seemed to involve treating the vacuum of space as just another battlefield environment to be exploited for tactical advantage. "There inside the command ships," Santos observed with the detached professionalism of someone commenting on weather patterns. "Vorthak internal security is having difficulty adapting to boarding actions conducted by enemies who don't require life support systems." Kethvar studied the technical readouts streaming across his displays. The modifications the humans had made to themselves went beyond anything his medical training could properly categorize. They had somehow managed to alter their basic biological requirements to the point where traditional environmental limitations no longer applied, but the cost of such modifications should have been prohibitive. What's the survival rate for individuals who undergo these modifications? Kethvar asked. Approximately 15%. Santos replied without hesitation. The process of optimization for combat effectiveness is intensive. Most candidates don't survive the conversion process. And you implemented this knowing that you would lose 80% to 5% of your population? We implemented this knowing that we needed to ensure 100% mission effectiveness for the 15% who survived the process. The mathematical brutality of that calculation made Kethvar's diplomatic training activate every protocol designed for dealing with civilizations that had moved beyond boundaries of rational behavior. The humans had voluntarily sacrificed most of their population to transform the survivors into something that could accomplish objectives that normal human beings would have found impossible. This is madness, Kethvar whispered. This is human logic, Santos corrected. When faced with an enemy that threatens our existence, we don't calculate acceptable loss ratios or strategic resource allocation. We calculate the maximum possible effectiveness we can achieve with available materials, then implement that calculation regardless of cost. New alerts sounded throughout the command center, and Kethvar's attention was drawn to orbital sensors that were reporting something his scientific training insisted was impossible. The Vorthak fleet wasn't just being prevented from retreating, it was being systematically destroyed by forces that shouldn't have been capable of threatening capital-class starships. They're winning, Kethvar realized. Against impossible odds, with inadequate equipment, after suffering casualties that should have eliminated their combat effectiveness entirely, they're actually winning. They were always going to win, Ambassador, Santos said quietly. The question was never whether human forces could overcome Vorthak military superiority. The question was whether we could demonstrate the cost of threatening humanity clearly enough that other species would understand the mathematics of the situation.
What mathematics? Santos manipulated her displays to show strategic projections that extended far beyond the current engagement.
Every species the Vorthak have conquered has fought according to conventional military principles. They've calculated loss ratios, resource expenditure, strategic value of objectives. When the cost of conquest exceeded the value of victory, they accepted defeat according to rational military logic. She highlighted specific data points that showed the progression of Vorthak conquests over the past century. But humans don't fight according to rational military logic. We fight according to human military logic. And human military logic states that there is no cost too high to pay if the alternative is allowing our enemies to threaten something we've decided to protect. The distinction was becoming clear to Kethvar as he watched the orbital battle develop. The Vorthak had built their entire military doctrine around the assumption that every enemy would eventually reach a point where continued resistance became irrational. They had never encountered an enemy for whom the concept of irrational resistance was a contradiction in terms. You're not just fighting to defend this world, Kethvar said. You're fighting to establish a precedent. We're fighting to ensure that every military strategist in the galaxy understands that attacking humanity requires completely different mathematical frameworks than attacking any other species, Santos confirmed. Because when humans fight, we don't fight until victory becomes impossible. We fight until the other side decides that victory isn't worth the cost. Above them, the last Vorthak command ships were being systematically disabled by boarding parties that shouldn't have been able to survive in space, using tactics that shouldn't have been effective against superior technology, achieving objectives that should have been beyond the capabilities of any force that had suffered such massive casualties. How many of your people are still alive? Kethvar asked. On the surface, approximately 230. In orbital operations, perhaps 50. Santos's tone remained as calm as if she were discussing supply inventories, well within acceptable parameters for mission completion. Acceptable parameters? Kethvar's voice cracked with strain. You've lost over 90% of your population. We've achieved 100% mission effectiveness with available resources, Santos corrected. The mathematics are quite favorable when viewed from the proper perspective. Kethvar found himself staring at displays showing the destruction of military forces that had conquered half the known galaxy. Accomplished by fewer than 300 human beings who had voluntarily transformed themselves into weapons capable of achieving impossible objectives, through the simple expedient of refusing to acknowledge that those objectives were impossible. What are you going to do when this is over? Kethvar asked. Assuming any of you survive to see the end of the engagement? Santos turned to face him directly, and her expression carried something that made every diplomatic instinct Kethvar possessed activate emergency protocols. Ambassador, you're still thinking about this engagement as if it has an ending, but this isn't a battle that ends when the shooting stops. This is a demonstration that ends when the rest of the galaxy understands the lesson we're teaching, which is that humanity is the species other species call when they need something impossible accomplished, and that enemies who force us to demonstrate our capabilities usually don't survive the educational process. The final Vorthak ship exploded in a burst of light that was visible even through the atmospheric haze surrounding Zirian Prime. An entire invasion fleet, the largest military force the galaxy had seen in 3 centuries, had been destroyed by a handful of human defenders who had somehow managed to transform total defeat into absolute victory through methods that defied every principle of rational warfare. It's over, Kethvar said. No, Ambassador, Santos replied, already turning her attention to new displays that showed strategic communications being transmitted to every inhabited system within a 50 light-year radius. It's beginning! What happened here today will be studied by military strategists for the next 1,000 years, and every analysis will reach the same conclusion. Which is? Santos smiled, and Kethvar finally understood why ancient star charts marked human space with symbols that meant approach with extreme caution in languages that had been dead for millennia. That there are some lines you don't cross, some species you don't threaten, and some lessons you don't want to learn the hard way, and that humans are all 3. 3 standard months after the Battle of Zarian Prime, Kethvar stood before the full assembly of the Galactic Council, preparing to deliver a report that would fundamentally alter how the galaxy understood warfare, sacrifice, and the species that called itself human. The council chamber contained representatives from 47 civilizations, each species having evolved unique perspectives on conflict, cooperation, and survival. What they shared was a common framework of rational behavior, the assumption that all sentient life operated according to logical principles of resource management, risk assessment, and strategic calculation. Kethvar's report was about to shatter those assumptions. Honored representatives, he began, his voice carrying through translation matrices that rendered his words comprehensible to species whose communication methods ranged from biochemical secretions to quantum field manipulation. What I witnessed on Zarian Prime represents a paradigm shift in our understanding of military capability, strategic doctrine, and the nature of human psychology. The preliminary data had already been distributed throughout the Council's intelligence networks. Every representative present had access to technical specifications, casualty reports, and tactical analyses that documented the destruction of the largest Vorthak invasion force in recorded history by fewer than 3,000 human defenders. What they lacked was context for understanding how such an outcome had been possible. The Vorthak hegemony, Kethvar continued, built their military doctrine around a fundamental principle that has proven effective against every previous enemy. Overwhelming force applied against opponents who fight according to rational strategic calculations. Their invasion of Zarian Prime was planned using these same principles. He activated the chamber's central display, showing tactical projections that demonstrated the mathematical certainty of Vorthak victory based on every conventional military analysis. 12 million assault troops against 3,000 defenders. Superior technology, complete orbital control, strategic reserves that outnumbered the entire human population of the target world. By every rational calculation, Kethvar explained, human resistance should have collapsed within hours of first contact. Instead, the engagement continued for 18 hours and concluded with the complete destruction of Vorthak forces and the survival of approximately 200 human defenders. Murmurs of confusion and disbelief rippled through the assembly. The crystalline hierarchy's representative pulsed with patterns that translated as skeptical inquiry. The Hive Mind Collective's delegate emitted chemical signals that indicated request for clarification. Even the ancient ethereals, whose consciousness spanned multiple dimensions simultaneously, projected uncertainty regarding the data they were receiving. Ambassador Kethvar, interrupted the representative from the Terran Confederation. Surely there were factors not accounted for in preliminary intelligence estimates, hidden defensive installations, undisclosed technological capabilities, strategic support from allied species. None, Kethvar replied firmly. Human forces fought with technology that lagged behind Galactic Council standards by approximately 50 years. They received no external support. They possessed no hidden installations or weapon systems beyond what had been documented in routine colonial surveys. Then how? The question came from the mechanical synthesis, whose artificial intelligence networks had spent weeks attempting to model scenarios in which such an outcome would be mathematically possible. Because humans don't fight according to the mathematical principles that govern every other species represented in this chamber, HFY explained. They fight according to human principles, and human principles operate from fundamentally different assumptions about the relationship between cost and value. He modified the display to show psychological profiles that the human survivors had voluntarily provided during post-engagement interviews. What the data revealed challenged every assumption the Council's xenopsychology specialists had developed regarding human motivation and decision-making processes. The human defenders underwent voluntary modifications that altered their basic physiology, neurology, and psychological processing, HFY reported. These modifications eliminated self-preservation instincts, enhanced physical capability beyond baseline human norms, and created collective consciousness networks that allowed perfect tactical coordination between individuals. Temporary modifications, asked the representative from the Peaceful Convergence whose species had developed elaborate philosophical frameworks specifically to prevent the kind of militaristic evolution that led to self-destructive warfare. Permanent, HFY confirmed. The modifications cannot be reversed. Individuals who underwent the process can never return to baseline human psychology or physiology. They have essentially transformed themselves into a completely different type of organism optimized for warfare. The implications of that statement created a silence in the chamber that transcended species barriers. Every civilization represented had developed safeguards against the kind of evolutionary militarism that led to societies consuming themselves in pursuit of military effectiveness. The concept that an entire population would voluntarily undergo irreversible transformation for tactical advantage violated fundamental assumptions about rational behavior. How many humans underwent these modifications? Asked the Eternal Watcher's delegate, whose species had observed galactic events for millennia without finding precedent for such collective self-alteration. According to Director Santos, approximately 12,000 individuals volunteered for the modification process. HFY replied. Of those, roughly 1,800 survived the transformation. The human population of Zerion Prime essentially sacrificed 85% of their people to create a force capable of achieving what they considered necessary tactical objectives.
This is pathological, declared the representative from the Rational Unity, whose civilization had built their entire social structure around logical optimization of resource allocation.
No strategic objective can justify such catastrophic loss rates among defending populations. That assessment assumes that human strategic objectives operate according to rational optimization principles, HFY said. But as I observed during my time on Zerion Prime, human strategic planning operates from different assumptions entirely. He modified the display again, showing recordings from the final phases of the battle. What the footage revealed had required extensive authentication by Council technical specialists, because the events documented seemed to violate basic principles of physics as well as military doctrine. Human forces didn't fight to achieve victory as defined by conventional military terminology, HFY explained. They fought to demonstrate that attacking humanity carries costs that exceed any rational benefit calculation. They transformed their own destruction into a weapon more effective than any technology represented in this chamber. The recordings showed human soldiers continuing combat operations in environments that should have been lethal to biological organisms. They documented tactical coordination that functioned independently of communication infrastructure. Most disturbing, they revealed human forces that became more effective as casualties mounted rather than less. This isn't warfare, observed the representative from the contemplative orders. This is ritualized extinction designed to traumatize enemies into behavioral modification. Exactly. HFY confirmed. Human military doctrine, as demonstrated on Zerion Prime, isn't designed to win individual engagements. It's designed to ensure that potential enemies understand the consequences of forcing humans to fight. And what are those consequences? Asked the Council President, whose position required him to synthesize information from dozens of species into coherent policy frameworks. HFY activated the final component of his presentation, strategic analyses that showed the galactic implications of what had occurred on Zerion Prime. The data revealed changes in military planning, diplomatic relationships, and territorial expansion policies that had already begun propagating throughout known space. The consequences, HFY said, are that every military strategist in the galaxy now understands that conflict with humanity requires completely different risk assessment methodologies than conflict with any other species, because humans are willing to pay costs that no rational analysis would consider acceptable in order to inflict costs that no rational enemy would consider acceptable. He highlighted specific changes in territorial policies that had emerged in the months following the battle, species that had been planning expansion into systems adjacent to human space had quietly abandoned those plans. Military forces that had been positioned for operations in sectors containing human colonies had been reassigned to different strategic priorities. Most significantly, the Vorthak hegemony itself had declared a moratorium on further expansion until new military doctrines could be developed to address what their strategic planners termed irrational enemy response matrices. The lesson the galaxy has learned, Kethvar concluded, is that humanity represents a unique form of defensive capability. Not because humans are militarily superior to other species, but because humans define military victory differently than other species. When humans fight, they fight to teach lessons that their enemies will never forget.
What does this mean for Council policy regarding human space? Asked the representative from the Commercial Federation, whose species had extensive trade relationships with human colonies. It means, Kethvar replied, that human space should be considered permanently defended by forces that operate outside conventional military parameters.
Any species contemplating aggressive action against human territories should understand that they will face opponents who consider their own extinction an acceptable cost, if it prevents enemy objectives from being achieved. And what of humans who have undergone these modifications? Pressed the Peaceful Convergence delegate. Can they be integrated into normal galactic society, or do they represent a permanent military threat? Kethvar had anticipated this question, though he wasn't certain his answer would be reassuring to species that valued stability and predictability. The surviving defenders of Zerion Prime have established what they call a remembrance protocol. They maintain their combat modifications, but dedicate their existence to ensuring that the galaxy understands the lessons learned from their sacrifice. They're living weapons, translated the mechanical synthesis representative. They're living reminders, Kethvar corrected. Their existence serves as permanent documentation of what happens when humanity is forced to choose between surrender and extinction. And their presence ensures that the galaxy will never forget the cost of making humans face that choice. The chamber fell into contemplative silence as representatives processed the implications of Kethvar's report. Each species would interpret the information according to their own philosophical frameworks and strategic priorities, but all would reach the same fundamental conclusion. Honored representatives, Kethvar said in closing, I recommend that the Council formally recognize human space as permanently defended by forces that operate beyond conventional military parameters, not as a threat to galactic stability, but as a guarantee of it. Because the galaxy now contains a species that will pay any price to protect what they consider worth protecting. And knowing that such a species exists will encourage others to resolve their conflicts through negotiation rather than conquest. As the Assembly began its formal deliberations, Kethvar reflected on the words that Director Santos had spoken during their final conversation on Zerion Prime. We're not the species other civilizations should fear. We're the species other civilizations should be grateful exists. Because when something threatens the galaxy, someone has to be willing to pay the price to stop it. The Battle of Zerion Prime had taught the galaxy many lessons. But perhaps the most important was that in a universe full of predators, it was useful to have allies who had voluntarily transformed themselves into something even predators learned to avoid. The humans had shown the stars what they were capable of when pushed beyond all reasonable limits. And the stars wisely had chosen to remember. S.